I'm Kyle Bachus. On April 28th of 2020, my mom was killed as a result of someone else's negligence. It's completely changed my life and the way I practice law. If you too have felt the pain of losing a loved one and you don't know where to turn, let me be your guide on what to do next when the unthinkable happens.
One of the things that you have to consider after you've had a catastrophic injury is whether or not there is a need for long-term accommodations of some type. There's something in the law, in federal law, called the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 1990, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. People don't realize it, but it really is just an extension of American civil rights law. And basically what it says is that you cannot be discriminated in the United States of America based upon any disability that you have. And so what the Americans with Disabilities Act did really is it just expanded those same rights that you already had not to be discriminated against and applied them to people with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act applies to your workplace, which is hugely important. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, if you need an accommodation and you have a doctor indicating that it's necessary, you can go to your employer, and it now applies to any employer with more than 15 employees, and you have some sort of long-term need that requires an accommodation. You get a written document saying what those accommodations are. There are some businesses that can't accommodate. And so there is some tension sometimes between the employer and the employee. The employee has a right to accommodation, but the employer has to accommodate so long as it doesn't interfere with the employer's ability to run their business. What I find is that most employers are more than happy to make the accommodations. Sometimes it's the person who's been injured who's reluctant to acknowledge their need and acknowledge that they should seek accommodation. And so if you are in that situation or you have a family member in that situation, I encourage you to acknowledge the limitations to make sure that you can do everything you can do to get better, including in the workplace, by getting the accommodations that are necessary to help you get better. Okay? So the Americans with Disabilities Act provides that you cannot be discriminated against based upon a disability in any public setting. But it doesn't necessarily cover things like your apartment, because that's not a public setting. Certainly, the office where you go to lease your apartment is a public setting, and they have to accommodate disabilities and access there. However, there is a different law from the same era. I believe it's 1988 instead of 1990. But in 1988, the Fair Housing Act was passed by Congress. Now, this says that it is a requirement that if you have rental housing, that you have to allow accommodations to be made for people with disabilities inside that housing. The Fair Housing Act requires that the apartment complexes make the units available for accommodation, but it doesn't require the apartment complex to pay for those disability accommodations. The good news is that if you have a need for accommodations as a result of a car crash or something like that, you qualify in most states as a crime victim, and in most states there are crime victims compensation funds that can be utilized to pay for the accommodations that you need. So it's kind of a two-step process. One is you locate an apartment unit, and hopefully it's built after 1991, and you then make the request. You have to make the request of the landlord for the accommodations. Then you have to find the funding for those accommodations. And like I said, that would be through the Victims Compensation Fund or other avenues of recovery that your lawyer could talk to you about if you run into problems there. Then the accommodations are made, and that's a requirement that they adhere to those in your apartment space. And then in the common spaces, the Americans with Disabilities Act makes sure that you have access in and out of the area through the parking lots, etc. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires that you not be discriminated against in the public spaces.